Welcome back to Let's Get Weird in the Dark. This is part 2 of our exploration into the Flannan Isles Lighthouse mystery. In part 1, we examined the disappearance of 3 keepers from a remote Scottish lighthouse in December 1900. We walked through the discovery, the investigation, the theories, and the most likely explanation. We separated historical fact from over a century of embellishment and legend. But the Flannan Isles case wasn't unique. It's the most famous lighthouse mystery, yes. But it's not the only one. Throughout the history of lighthouse keeping, there have been other disappearances. Other strange deaths. Other cases where keepers vanished or died under mysterious circumstances. Tonight, we'll explore those other cases. We'll look at the dangers of lighthouse keeping. The isolation. The psychological toll. The ways men died maintaining lights on remote rocks and distant shores. And we'll see that while Flannan Isles captured public imagination, it was part of a larger pattern. A pattern of isolation, danger, and the ocean's indifference to human life. Close your eyes. Settle in. Let's explore the dark history of lighthouse keeping. To understand lighthouse mysteries, you need to understand the work itself. Lighthouse keeping in the 19th and early 20th centuries was among the most isolated occupations in existence. Keepers lived for weeks or months at a time on remote rocks, isolated islands, or desolate coastlines. They were cut off from civilization, from families, from any social contact beyond their fellow keepers. The work was dangerous. Supplies had to be delivered by boat, which required calm weather and safe landing conditions. Sometimes boats couldn't reach stations for weeks during winter storms. Keepers ran low on food, fuel, fresh water. They made do with what they had. Medical emergencies were particularly terrifying. If a keeper became sick or injured, there was no help. No doctor. No hospital. Just whatever medical supplies were on hand and whatever knowledge the other keepers possessed. Men died from appendicitis, from infected wounds, from illnesses that would have been treatable in civilization. The psychological toll was severe. Isolation drives people to desperation. Some keepers went mad. Some became violent. Some simply couldn't handle the loneliness and quit after one rotation. Those who stayed long-term were either unusually resilient or unusually damaged by the experience. And then there was the ocean itself. Waves that could reach extraordinary heights. Storms that lasted for days. The constant sound of water crashing against rock. The knowledge that you were surrounded by something vast and powerful that could kill you at any moment. Lighthouse keeping attracted a certain type of person. Men who could handle isolation. Who were comfortable with risk. Who didn't mind being away from normal society for extended periods. But even for these men, the work took its toll. One of the earliest and most disturbing lighthouse incidents occurred at Smalls Lighthouse, off the coast of Wales, in 1801. Smalls was a rock lighthouse. A tower built on a tiny outcrop 20 miles from shore. No land. No shelter. Just the lighthouse rising from the sea. 2 keepers were stationed there. Thomas Howell and Thomas Griffith. They didn't get along. They'd argued repeatedly during previous rotations. The relationship was hostile, filled with mutual dislike and distrust. In December 1801, during a severe storm, Thomas Griffith became ill. The illness progressed rapidly. Within days, he was dead. Thomas Howell was now alone on the rock with a corpse. And he faced a terrible problem. If he disposed of the body at sea, he had no witnesses. No way to prove he hadn't murdered Griffith. Everyone knew they hated each other. If he returned to shore saying Griffith had died of natural causes and the body was gone, he'd likely be accused of murder and hanged. So Howell made a decision. He would keep the body. He would wait for the relief boat. He would have witnesses to prove Griffith had died of illness, not violence. He built a crude coffin from spare wood. He placed Griffith's body inside and lashed it to the outside of the lighthouse, on the gallery that encircled the light room. The winter cold would preserve the body. The relief boat would arrive in 2 weeks. He just had to wait. But the relief boat didn't come in 2 weeks. The storms were too severe. The seas too rough. Week after week passed. The boat couldn't reach Smalls. Thomas Howell was alone on that rock with his dead companion for over 2 months. 60 days. With Thomas Griffith's corpse lashed to the outside gallery. The storms battered the makeshift coffin. The wood began to break apart. Griffith's arm came loose and hung down, visible from the windows. When wind struck the lighthouse just right, the arm would move. It would wave. It would tap against the glass. Howell began to lose his mind. The isolation. The storms. The corpse outside his window. The arm that seemed to wave at him in the darkness. The sound of it tapping. The knowledge that he was trapped with death itself. He stopped sleeping. He couldn't eat. He paced the lighthouse, talking to himself, jumping at every sound. He wrote increasingly desperate entries in the log, begging for relief, describing his deteriorating mental state. When the relief boat finally reached Smalls in late February, they found Howell barely alive. Emaciated. Incoherent. His hair, which had been dark, had turned completely white. He was raving about the arm. About Griffith watching him. About death stalking the lighthouse. They took him off the rock. He never recovered mentally. He spent his remaining years broken, haunted by those 2 months alone with a corpse. The incident led to a major policy change. After Smalls, the Northern Lighthouse Board mandated that no station could be staffed by fewer than 3 keepers. If one died, at least 2 would remain. No one would ever be alone with death again. But 3 keepers didn't guarantee safety. As Flannan Isles proved. Eilean Moor, the island where Flannan Isles Lighthouse stood, had always made keepers uneasy. Multiple keepers reported strange feelings. Sounds they couldn't explain. A sense of being watched. One keeper, before the disappearance, wrote to his supervisor requesting transfer. He said the island felt wrong. That something about it disturbed him. He couldn't be specific. Just a feeling. An atmosphere. His request was denied. Feelings weren't grounds for transfer. He completed his rotation and left. He was lucky. After the 1900 disappearance, the lighthouse continued operating with new crews. But keepers remained uneasy. Reports continued of strange sounds. Of feeling watched. Of an oppressive atmosphere that made men want to leave. Some of this can be attributed to psychology. After 3 keepers vanished mysteriously, subsequent crews naturally felt anxious. The knowledge of what happened colored their experience. Every strange sound became ominous. Every rough night became a reminder of the danger. But the consistency of the reports is notable. Different crews, over decades, describing similar feelings. Similar experiences. As if the island itself carried something. A memory. An atmosphere. A warning. Bishop Rock Lighthouse, off the southwestern tip of England, has its own dark history. The rock is tiny. Barely large enough for the lighthouse foundation. Waves regularly wash completely over it during storms. It's one of the most exposed lighthouse stations in the British Isles. In 1874, during construction of the second lighthouse tower, a worker disappeared. He was there one moment, checking equipment at the base of the tower. Gone the next. No one saw what happened. No body was ever found. After the lighthouse was completed and operational, keepers reported seeing a figure at the base of the tower. A man in work clothes, visible for just seconds before vanishing. Always in the same spot where the construction worker disappeared. Multiple keepers, across different crews, reported the same sighting. Always the same figure. Same location. Same brief appearance and disappearance. Was it real? A ghost? Or was it the psychological effect of knowing someone died there, combined with the stress of isolation and the tricks light and spray can play on tired eyes? The reports eventually stopped. Either keepers stopped seeing the figure, or they stopped reporting it. But Bishop Rock's reputation remained. It was considered one of the hardest postings. Not because of the physical conditions, though those were brutal, but because of the atmosphere. The history. The feeling that the rock had claimed someone and might claim again. These cases, Smalls, Flannan Isles, Bishop Rock, are just the beginning. Lighthouse history is filled with disappearances, mysterious deaths, and unexplained incidents. Some have rational explanations. Some remain ambiguous. All share common elements of isolation, danger, and the psychological toll of living on the edge of civilization. In the next segment, we'll explore more of these cases. We'll look at keepers who went mad. Murders that occurred in isolated stations. The strange deaths and disappearances that marked lighthouse history throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. St. Agnes Lighthouse, on the Isles of Scilly off the southwestern tip of England, was the scene of a disappearance in 1853. The principal keeper, William Jones, lived at the station with his assistant. One morning in March, Jones went out to perform maintenance work on the exterior of the lighthouse. Routine work. Something he'd done hundreds of times before. His assistant was inside, tending to duties in the lamp room. When he came back down an hour later, Jones was gone. The assistant searched the station grounds. Called out. No response. He checked the rocks around the lighthouse base. The landing area. The storage buildings. Nothing. William Jones had simply vanished. He'd been working on the lighthouse exterior, visible from multiple angles. And then he wasn't there anymore. No body was found. No evidence of what happened. No witnesses. The official conclusion was that he'd fallen from the lighthouse while working and his body had been swept out to sea. But the weather that day was calm. The seas were light. Jones was experienced and careful. And no one heard a cry for help. No splash. No sound at all. His assistant reported that Jones had seemed troubled in the days before his disappearance. Quieter than usual. Distracted. As if something was weighing on his mind. But he hadn't said what. The mystery was never solved. Jones' family received no closure. The lighthouse was restaffed. Life continued. But for those who knew the case, questions remained. What happened in that hour between being seen and being gone? Fastnet Rock Lighthouse, off the coast of Ireland, was and remains one of the most isolated and exposed stations in existence. The rock is tiny. The lighthouse tower rises directly from the Atlantic. During storms, waves wash completely over the structure. In 1881, 3 keepers were stationed there during one of the worst storms in decades. For 3 days, waves pounded the lighthouse. The keepers couldn't go outside. They were trapped inside the tower, listening to the ocean trying to destroy their refuge. On the third day, the storm broke. The sea calmed. A relief vessel made its way to Fastnet to check on the keepers and deliver supplies. They found 2 keepers alive. The third was dead. And his death was strange. The dead keeper, Joseph Murphy, was found in his bunk. No visible injuries. No signs of illness. He appeared to have died in his sleep. But his face was twisted in an expression of terror. His hands were clenched. His eyes were open, staring at something. The 2 surviving keepers said Murphy had been fine during the storm. He'd performed his duties normally. He'd eaten. He'd talked with them. On the night he died, he'd gone to his bunk to sleep during his off shift. When they checked on him the next morning, he was dead. They couldn't explain the expression on his face. The terror. He hadn't called out. Hadn't made any sound. He'd just died. Afraid of something they couldn't see. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure. Probably accurate. Hearts do fail. But what caused the failure? What did Murphy see or experience in his final moments that left such terror on his face? The 2 surviving keepers refused to return to Fastnet. They requested transfers to any other station. They wouldn't say why. Just that they couldn't go back. Something about Murphy's death had frightened them deeply. Scaravore Lighthouse, off the coast of Scotland, was considered one of the great achievements of Victorian engineering. Built on a remote reef, it required years of dangerous construction work. Workers died during its building. But when it was completed in 1844, it was magnificent. Solid. Built to last centuries. In 1877, the lighthouse experienced what keepers called the Night of Terror. 3 keepers were on duty during a severe Atlantic storm. The waves reached extraordinary heights, battering the tower. But the lighthouse was built for this. It had weathered worse storms. Around midnight, something struck the lighthouse. Not a wave. Something solid. The entire tower shook. The keepers, in the living quarters, felt the impact like an earthquake. The lamp at the top of the tower went dark momentarily from the vibration. They climbed up to investigate. Everything appeared intact. The lamp was undamaged. The tower showed no cracks or structural issues. But they could hear something. A grinding sound. Something scraping against the exterior of the lighthouse. For hours, throughout the night, the scraping continued. The keepers couldn't see what was causing it. The darkness and spray made observation impossible. But they could hear it. Feel it through the walls. Something was out there, in the storm, repeatedly striking or scraping the lighthouse. By dawn, the storm had diminished. The scraping stopped. The keepers went outside to investigate. They found deep gouges in the stone blocks near the base of the tower. Long scratches in the rock. As if something had clawed at the lighthouse throughout the night. The official explanation was debris. A large piece of timber or wreckage from a ship, caught in the waves, repeatedly striking the tower. This would account for the scraping, the gouges, the solid impacts. But the keepers insisted it was something else. The pattern was wrong for random debris. The scraping was too regular. Too deliberate. They believed something had been trying to get into the lighthouse. Something large and strong that the storm had brought from the deep. They reported this in the logbook. The officials dismissed it as imagination and storm stress. But the gouges in the stone were real. Something had marked the lighthouse that night. These incidents, disappearances, strange deaths, unexplained phenomena, took a psychological toll on lighthouse keepers across the system. Keepers talked among themselves. Stories spread. Every station had its history, its incidents, its ghost stories. Men who went to new postings knew the reputation of each lighthouse. Which ones were considered safe? Which ones had troubled histories? Some keepers developed what we'd now recognize as anxiety disorders. They became hypervigilant, constantly watching for danger, unable to relax even during calm weather. The isolation and stress had worn down their mental resilience. Others developed paranoia. They believed the lighthouses themselves were malevolent, that the rocks held dark forces, that something in the ocean wanted them dead. These men usually didn't last long in the service. They'd quit or be removed for mental instability. A few went violently mad. These cases were the most dangerous. A keeper who lost his grip on reality, trapped on a remote rock with only one or two other men, could do terrible damage before help arrived. The Northern Lighthouse Board kept records of these incidents. Not publicized, but documented. They knew the work broke some men. They tried to screen applicants carefully. But you couldn't always predict who would handle the isolation and who would crack under it. In 1882, at a lighthouse station off the coast of Norway, a murder occurred. 3 keepers were stationed at the isolated rock lighthouse. They'd been together for 2 months. Tensions had been building. Personality conflicts. Arguments over minor issues. The kind of friction that develops when people are trapped together with no escape. One night, during an argument over something trivial, one keeper attacked another with a knife. The assault was sudden and vicious. The victim died within minutes. The third keeper witnessed it all, trapped in the confined space with a murderer. For 3 days, the surviving keeper and the murderer shared the lighthouse. The murderer showed no remorse. He simply went about his duties. The other keeper, terrified, kept his distance. Slept with a weapon. Waited for the relief boat. When the boat finally arrived and the murder was reported, the killer claimed self-defense. Said the victim had attacked him first. But the witness contradicted this. The evidence supported murder, not self-defense. The killer was removed, tried, and convicted. But the incident highlighted a terrifying reality of lighthouse work. If violence erupted, there was no help. No police to call. No escape. Just other keepers, hopefully strong enough to restrain or defend against an attacker, and a desperate wait for the next supply boat. After this incident, lighthouse services began psychological screening more seriously. They looked for signs of violent tendencies. Instability. Inability to handle conflict without violence. But screening was imperfect. Other violent incidents would occur over the years. Looking at lighthouse incidents across decades and countries, patterns emerge. Disappearances occur most often during storms. This makes sense. Storms create dangerous conditions. Waves can sweep people away. But some disappearances occur in calm weather, which is harder to explain. Deaths from madness or violence are more common at the most isolated stations. The more remote the lighthouse, the harder the psychological toll. Rock lighthouses are worse than island lighthouses. Stations far from shore are worse than coastal stations. Strange phenomena, sounds, sightings, unexplained events, cluster at certain locations. Some lighthouses have multiple generations of keepers reporting similar experiences. Others have no such reports despite being equally isolated and dangerous. This clustering suggests something about the locations themselves. Perhaps some places have unusual acoustic properties that create strange sounds. Perhaps geological features cause unusual wave patterns or vibrations. Perhaps human psychology responds to certain environments in consistent ways. Or perhaps some places genuinely are stranger than others. Whether you attribute it to natural causes or something else, the pattern is real. We've covered disappearances at St. Agnes, strange death at Fastnet Rock, the night of terror at Skarevor, murder in Norway, and the psychological patterns that emerge from lighthouse history. In the next segment, we'll look at specific cases of keepers who went mad. The progression of their mental deterioration. What isolation and stress did to human minds. And how their fellow keepers dealt with sharing small spaces with men losing their sanity. Madness at a lighthouse didn't happen suddenly. It was a gradual deterioration. A slow unraveling of mental stability that other keepers would watch with growing alarm. The first signs were usually subtle. A keeper becoming withdrawn. Speaking less. Spending more time alone. This could be normal adjustment to isolation. Or it could be the beginning of something worse. Next came sleep disturbance. The keeper would stop sleeping at normal times. Would pace at night. Would be found staring out windows during hours when he should be resting. Sleep deprivation accelerated mental decline. Then came irrational fears. The keeper would become convinced something was wrong. That danger was approaching. That enemies were nearby. These fears had no basis in reality but felt completely real to the person experiencing them. Finally came the break. Hallucinations. Violent outbursts. Complete loss of contact with reality. At this point, the keeper was dangerous. To himself and to others. And there was no help available except whatever the other keepers could provide. Let's look at specific cases. Bell Rock Lighthouse, off the coast of Scotland, was the scene of a mental breakdown in 1827. One of the assistant keepers, a man named Robert Stevenson, began showing signs of instability after 6 weeks on station. He stopped participating in normal conversation. He would stand at the windows for hours, staring at the ocean. When asked what he was looking at, he'd say he was counting the waves. His fellow keepers initially thought this was harmless eccentricity. Many lighthouse keepers developed odd habits. But Stevenson's behavior escalated. He began insisting that the waves were speaking to him. That they contained messages he needed to decode. He started writing in the logbook at odd hours, long strings of numbers he claimed were the wave patterns. The numbers made no sense. They were random. But to Stevenson, they had meaning. He stopped eating. Said he didn't need food anymore. That the ocean would sustain him. His fellow keepers tried to force him to eat, but he became combative. Violent when they approached with food. After 2 weeks of this behavior, the principal keeper realized Stevenson was completely mad. He restrained him using rope, securing him to his bunk for his own safety. Stevenson raved about the ocean calling him. About needing to go to the waves. About messages only he could hear. The relief boat wasn't due for another week. The principal keeper and the remaining assistant had to maintain the station while keeping Stevenson restrained and attempting to care for him. He barely slept. When he did, he had violent nightmares and would wake screaming. When the relief boat finally arrived, Stevenson was taken off the rock. He was committed to an asylum. He never recovered. He spent the rest of his life insisting the waves had messages. That he needed to return to decode them. That the ocean was waiting for him. Minot's Ledge Lighthouse, off the coast of Massachusetts, had a reputation as a destroyer of men's minds. The original lighthouse, completed in 1850, was built on iron stilts driven into an underwater ledge. During storms, the entire structure would shake violently. The keepers, living in the small house at the top of the stilts, would feel the whole building sway. Sometimes it would move so much that furniture would slide across the floor. The constant motion, the vibration, the feeling of instability, it affected keepers psychologically. Several developed what we'd now call motion sickness that never went away. They felt dizzy even when the structure wasn't moving. Their sense of balance was permanently disrupted. But worse was the mental effect. Keepers reported feeling like they were going to fall even when standing still. They developed intense anxiety about the structure collapsing. They couldn't sleep because the vibration kept them in a state of constant alertness. In 1851, during a severe storm, 2 keepers were on duty when the lighthouse began shaking more violently than ever before. They lit distress signals, fired emergency rockets. But no rescue could reach them in the storm. The structure collapsed that night. Both keepers died. Their bodies were never found. When the new lighthouse was built in the same location in 1860, this time a solid stone tower, keepers still reported psychological problems. The memory of the first lighthouse colored their experience. They knew men had died there. They knew the ocean had destroyed the previous structure. And that knowledge created persistent anxiety. Multiple keepers requested transfers from Minot's Ledge, citing mental distress. The isolation combined with the history of the location was too much. Even the solid new lighthouse couldn't erase the fear. Wolf Rock Lighthouse, off the coast of Cornwall, saw a gradual mental breakdown in 1870. The assistant keeper, Thomas Williams, had been on station for 3 months. His behavior had been slowly changing. He'd become paranoid. He believed the principal keeper was plotting against him, poisoning his food, trying to drive him mad so he could claim Williams' position. None of this was true. The principal keeper, James Douglas, was a steady, reliable man with no interest in scheming. But Williams couldn't be convinced. His paranoia intensified. Williams started refusing to eat food prepared by Douglas. He would only eat from sealed containers. He insisted on preparing his own meals separately. He began sleeping with a knife under his pillow. Douglas recognized the signs of mental deterioration. He wrote in the logbook that Williams was becoming unstable and that relief was urgently needed. But the next scheduled relief was 2 weeks away, and weather prevented early arrival. One night, Williams had a complete break. He became convinced Douglas was about to kill him. He attacked with a knife he'd been keeping. Douglas, younger and stronger, managed to disarm him and wrestle him down. But now Douglas faced a problem. He was alone on the lighthouse with a violent, delusional man. Douglas restrained Williams using rope and chains. He kept him confined to one room. For 12 days, Douglas maintained the lighthouse alone while managing a prisoner who screamed accusations, threats, and incoherent ramblings. The isolation, the violence, the constant vigilance, it nearly broke Douglas too. When the relief boat finally arrived, Douglas was exhausted to the point of collapse. He'd barely slept in nearly 2 weeks. He'd maintained the light, cared for Williams as best he could, and kept himself safe. But the experience haunted him. Williams was committed to an asylum. He never worked as a keeper again. His paranoia never fully resolved. He remained convinced, until his death, that Douglas had tried to kill him. These cases of lighthouse madness share common elements. Isolation is the primary factor. Humans need social interaction. Extended isolation, especially with only one or two other people, strains mental health. Some people are more resilient than others, but everyone has limits. Monotony plays a role. The same routine, day after day. The same view. The same duties. The same conversations. The brain craves novelty. Denied it, psychological problems emerge. Stress compounds the issue. Living with constant awareness of danger. Knowing rescue is weeks away if something goes wrong. The responsibility of maintaining the light. All of this creates chronic stress that wears down mental resilience. Lack of escape is critical. On land, if you're having psychological problems, you can leave. Seek help. Change your environment. On a lighthouse rock, you're trapped. There's nowhere to go. No relief. Just waiting for the scheduled boat while your mind deteriorates. And finally, the ocean itself. The constant sound of waves. The vast emptiness surrounding you. The knowledge that you're on a tiny rock in the middle of something enormous and indifferent. This affects people in ways that are hard to articulate but very real. Not everyone broke under these conditions. Most keepers served long careers without serious mental problems. But enough broke that it was a recognized occupational hazard. The lighthouse service knew that isolation could destroy minds. After enough incidents of madness and violence, lighthouse services developed protocols. If a keeper showed signs of mental instability, the other keepers were to document it in the logbook. Note the behaviors. Record the progression. This created evidence and allowed authorities to track patterns. If possible, the unstable keeper should be isolated. Confined to separate quarters. Kept away from the lamp room and critical equipment. But this wasn't always practical in small lighthouse living spaces. If violence erupted or seemed imminent, restraint was authorized. Keepers were given basic training in how to safely restrain someone without causing injury. Rope and chains were part of standard lighthouse equipment, ostensibly for other purposes but available for this use. Emergency signals could be fired to alert passing ships that help was needed. But in remote areas, ships might not pass for days or weeks. The most important protocol was this: maintain the light. No matter what else was happening, the light had to burn. Ships depended on it. The keeper's duty to maritime safety superseded everything else, even mental health crises. This meant that keepers dealing with violent or delusional companions still had to climb to the lamp room every night. Still had to tend the mechanism. Still had to maintain watch. While simultaneously managing a dangerous situation below. The mental strain this created was enormous. But it was part of the job. We've examined cases of madness at Bell Rock, Minot's Ledge, and Wolf Rock. We've seen how isolation breaks some minds. How fellow keepers had to deal with deteriorating companions in isolated, dangerous circumstances. In the next segment, we'll look at the few cases where entire crews disappeared or died under mysterious circumstances. Events similar to Flannan Isles where all the keepers were lost and the cause remained unclear. The Flannan Isles disappearance was unusual not because keepers vanished, but because all three vanished simultaneously without explanation. Most lighthouse deaths involved single keepers. Occasionally two. But entire crews? That was rare. Yet it happened. More than once. And each time, it created the same questions. The same mystery. The same lack of answers. These cases deserve examination. Because they show that Flannan Isles, while the most famous, was not unique. The pattern existed. Has always existed. Will probably always exist wherever humans try to maintain lights in hostile, isolated locati. ONS. Triple Island Lighthouse, off the coast of British Columbia, Canada, experienced a crew loss in 1920. 20 years after Flannan Isles, and eerily similar. 3 keepers were stationed there. The lighthouse sat on a small, rocky island. Remote. Exposed to Pacific storms. Similar in many ways to the Flannan Isles. In November 1920, the relief boat arrived for the scheduled crew rotation. As they approached the island, they noticed the lighthouse wasn't operating. No light had been visible the previous night. The relief crew landed and climbed to the lighthouse. They found it empty. All 3 keepers were gone. The lighthouse was in order. No signs of struggle. No evidence of what had happened. A search of the island found no bodies. No abandoned equipment. No clues. 3 men had simply vanished. The investigation noted damage to the landing area. Rockfall and evidence of wave action. The official conclusion was that the keepers had been swept away while working at the landing, possibly during a storm several days earlier. But details didn't quite fit. Only 2 oilskins were missing. The 3rd was still hanging in the lighthouse. Sound familiar? The same detail that troubled the Flannan Isles investigation. Why would all 3 men go to the landing? Why wouldn't the 3rd take his weather gear? The same questions that haunted Flannan Isles haunted Triple Island. The case received less attention than Flannan because it occurred 20 years later, on a different continent, and the story didn't capture public imagination the same way. But the parallels are striking. Eddystone Lighthouse, off the coast of Plymouth, England, has a long and tragic history. The first lighthouse, completed in 1698, was destroyed by a storm in 1703. The keeper and his family died. The second lighthouse, completed in 1709, burned in 1755. 2 of the keepers died in the fire. One died in a particularly strange way. Henry Hall, the principal keeper, was fighting the fire when molten lead from the roof began dripping down. Lead was used in the roof construction, and the intense heat had melted it. Hall, looking up to assess the fire, had molten lead fall directly into his open mouth. He swallowed it before he could spit it out. He survived the immediate incident. He was rescued from the burning lighthouse along with the assistant keeper. But he died 12 days later, presumably from lead poisoning and internal injuries. However, Hall insisted until his death that the lead had settled in his stomach. That he could feel it there. A solid mass of metal inside him. The physicians treating him were skeptical. But when Hall died and an autopsy was performed, they found he was right. A 7-ounce piece of solidified lead was in his stomach. The molten metal had cooled and hardened inside him. Hall had lived 12 days with a piece of lead in his stomach. Fully aware of it. Able to describe the sensation. Knowing he was dying but unable to do anything about it. The Eddystone disaster wasn't a disappearance. We know exactly what happened. But it illustrates the unique horrors lighthouse keepers faced. Deaths that were slow, strange, and unavoidable. Graves Light, off the coast of Massachusetts, has a dark reputation. Multiple deaths over its operational history. Keepers who died in accidents. Who went mad? Who simply disappeared? In 1938, during a severe hurricane, the lighthouse took a direct hit from a massive wave. The wave shattered windows in the lamp room at the top of the tower. Over 100 feet above sea level. The 2 keepers on duty were in the lamp room when the wave struck. One was swept out through the shattered window. Gone instantly. Carried away by the retreating water. The other keeper, Joseph Lorenzen, managed to grab hold of the lamp mechanism. He held on as water surged through the room. When the wave receded, he was still there. Soaked. Cut from broken glass. But alive. He was alone now. His companion was gone. The lamp was damaged. Water poured through the broken windows. The hurricane still raged around him. Lorenzen spent the next 18 hours maintaining what remained of the light, boarding up windows with whatever materials he could find, and dealing with the trauma of watching his fellow keeper swept away before his eyes. When the hurricane passed and a rescue boat could reach Graves Light, they found Lorenzen exhausted but functional. He'd kept a light burning using emergency equipment. He'd managed the station alone through the worst of the storm. But Lorenzen was never the same. He completed that rotation, then requested immediate transfer to a land-based position. He couldn't return to a rock lighthouse. The memory of that wave, of his fellow keeper disappearing, was too much. The body of the swept-away keeper was never found. Just like Flannan Isles. Just like Triple Island. Gone into the ocean without a trace. Looking across these complete crew losses and near losses, certain patterns become clear. First, they almost always involve rock lighthouses. Isolated towers on small outcrops. Places where the ocean dominates. Island lighthouses see deaths too, but complete crew losses cluster at rock stations. Second, they tend to occur during or shortly after severe storms. Not always, but often enough to be notable. The storm creates conditions where multiple keepers might be outside, where waves can reach unusual heights, where normal caution might be overcome by urgency. Third, bodies are rarely found. The ocean takes them and doesn't give them back. This creates the mystery. If we had bodies, we'd have evidence. We could determine cause of death. But without bodies, we're left with speculation. Fourth, there are usually small details that don't fit. The missing oilskin at Flannan and Triple Island. The strange logbook entries. The damage that seems excessive even for the reported conditions. These details fuel speculation and keep the mysteries alive. And finally, official investigations almost always conclude swept away by waves. It's the most rational explanation. It accounts for the evidence. It requires no supernatural elements. But it never feels quite adequate. The details that don't fit nag at the conclusion. How many other cases occurred that weren't documented? How many keepers vanished from remote lighthouses in the 18th or early 19th centuries, before systematic record keeping, before investigations, before public attention? Lighthouse services in the 1700s and early 1800s were less organized. Record keeping was sporadic. Communication was slow. If keepers vanished from a remote station, particularly in a less developed region, it might not be investigated thoroughly. It might not be reported in newspapers. It might not enter the historical record. We know about Flannan Isles because it occurred in 1900, when journalism was established, when photography existed, when telegraph allowed rapid communication. The story spread quickly and thoroughly. But what about equivalent events a century earlier? How many similar disappearances occurred in the Age of Sail, at remote lighthouses around the world, that we simply don't know about? The records we have show a pattern. Logic suggests the pattern extends back beyond the records. That lighthouse keepers have been vanishing mysteriously for as long as lighthouses have existed. The ocean has always been dangerous. Isolation has always strained human psychology. Waves have always been capable of extraordinary violence. These factors haven't changed. They've existed since humans first tried to maintain lights for maritime safety. Which means cases like Flannan Isles have probably been happening for centuries. We just don't have records of most of them. We've examined complete crew losses at Triple Island and the deaths at Eddystone and Graves Light. We've seen patterns that suggest these events, while rare, aren't unique. And we've considered the likelihood of unrecorded cases stretching back into history. In the next segment, we'll look at what happened to lighthouse keeping after automation began. How the transition from manned to automated lighthouses changed the dangers. And what the future holds for these isolated structures that once housed men willing to risk everything to keep lights burning. By the mid-20th century, lighthouse services worldwide began exploring automation. Technology had advanced. Electric lights were reliable. Radio beacons could supplement or replace visual lights. And importantly, the cost and risk of maintaining manned stations was becoming harder to justify. The first fully automated lighthouses appeared in the 1920s and 30s. Simple stations where electric lights on timers could replace human keepers. These were mostly minor lights, harbor beacons, channel markers. Not the major coastal lighthouses that required complex maintenance. But technology improved rapidly. By the 1960s, automation systems could handle even major lighthouses. Solar panels. Battery backups. Automatic bulb changers that would rotate a new bulb into place if the primary failed. Remote monitoring from shore stations. The era of the lighthouse keeper was ending. For some, this was progress. No more men isolated on rocks for weeks at a time. No more deaths from storms or accidents. No more psychological breakdowns from isolation. The lights would burn just as reliably without the human cost. For others, it was the end of something important. A way of life. A tradition stretching back centuries. The lighthouse keeper had been a figure of reliability, dedication, duty. Replacing them with machines felt like a loss. But sentiment didn't stop progress. One by one, lighthouses were automated. Keepers were retired or reassigned to shore duties. The lights continued to burn, but the houses beneath them stood empty. Flannan Isles Lighthouse remained manned for 70 years after the 1900 disappearance. New crews rotated through. The work continued. But the reputation of the station never quite recovered. Keepers assigned to Flannan Isles knew the history. They knew about Duckett, Marshall, and MacArthur. They knew 3 men had vanished without explanation. And that knowledge colored their experience. Many keepers reported uneasiness at Flannan. Not supernatural experiences necessarily, but a persistent discomfort. A feeling of being watched. An awareness of the island's history that made every storm, every unusual sound, more ominous than it should be. Some refused to discuss the 1900 disappearance. Considered it bad luck to mention it. Others talked about it constantly, speculating endlessly about what might have happened. Both responses showed how deeply the mystery affected the station. In 1971, Flannan Isles was automated. The last keepers left the island. The lighthouse continued operating under remote control from shore. The automation was reliable. The light burned. Ships navigated safely. Everything functioned as designed. But the empty lighthouse, standing alone on that remote rock, took on a different character. With keepers present, it had been a working station. A place where men lived and worked despite the isolation and danger. Empty, it became something else. A monument. A memorial. A reminder of what had happened there. The transition to automation happened gradually across different countries and regions. Some lighthouses were automated in the 1960s. Others remained manned into the 1990s. The last manned lighthouse in the United States was Boston Light, which didn't fully automate until 1998. Even then, a keeper remained on station for historical and ceremonial purposes. In the United Kingdom, the last manned rock lighthouse was North Foreland in Kent, which automated in 1998. The last offshore lighthouse keeper in Scotland retired in 1998 as well. These final keepers represented the end of a profession that had existed for over 2 centuries. They were the last of a line stretching back to the earliest lighthouse builders. Many of the final generation of keepers were ambivalent about automation. They understood the benefits, recognized that the work was dangerous and isolating, knew that automation was safer and more cost-effective. But they also felt they were losing something irreplaceable: the satisfaction of maintaining a light, the pride in serving ships and sailors, the unique experience of living in isolation, testing themselves against nature and solitude. Interviews with retired keepers reveal a common theme. They missed the work. Not the danger or the isolation necessarily, but the purpose. The sense that they were doing something important, that ships and lives depended on them. Automation removed that purpose. The lights still burned, but no one was tending them. No one was there to make critical decisions during emergencies. No one was watching the sea, reading the weather, maintaining the equipment with skilled hands. After automation, different lighthouses met different fates. Some were maintained as automated stations and continue operating today. The lights burn. The solar panels charge batteries. Monitoring systems report status to shore. They function perfectly well without human presence. Others were decommissioned entirely. GPS and modern navigation made some lights redundant. They were shut down, the equipment removed, the buildings left to decay. A few were converted to museums or tourist attractions. Visitors can tour the keepers' quarters, climb the towers, see how lighthouse keepers lived. These preserved stations serve as historical education, showing a way of life that no longer exists. Some were sold to private owners, converted to vacation homes or artist retreats. The isolation that made them difficult for keepers makes them attractive to people seeking solitude, though usually with modern amenities the keepers never had. And some simply stand empty. Too remote to be tourist attractions. Too expensive to maintain as museums. Not suitable for private ownership. They're slowly deteriorating, returning to the rocks and islands that support them. Flannan Isles Lighthouse still operates. Automated. Unmanned. The light burns every night. But no one is there to see it. No one maintains the keeper's quarters. The rooms where Duckett, Marshall, and MacArthur lived are empty and silent. Automation eliminated most dangers to lighthouse keepers. But it created new risks. Automated lighthouses still require occasional maintenance. Technicians visit to service equipment, replace parts, perform inspections. These visits are usually brief. A few hours or at most a day or two. But they still require landing on remote rocks or islands. And landing remains dangerous. Storms still occur. Waves still batter rocks. Equipment still fails. The difference is that now when something goes wrong, there's no keeper on station to help. The technician is alone. There have been accidents. Technicians injured during maintenance. Falls. Equipment failures. Boats unable to retrieve workers due to changing weather. These incidents are rare, but they happen. The elimination of permanent keepers reduced the overall danger, but didn't eliminate it entirely. Someone still has to physically access these remote locations occasionally. And when they do, they face many of the same risks keepers faced. The difference is frequency. A keeper might face danger dozens of times per year. A technician might visit only once or twice. The cumulative risk is much lower. But the inherent danger of the locations hasn't changed. In the age of GPS, radar, and electronic navigation, lighthouses are less critical than they once were. Ships can navigate accurately without visual references. Electronic systems provide more precise positioning than any lighthouse could. Yet lighthouses continue to operate, partly as backup systems. Electronic navigation can fail. Storms can disrupt signals. Having visual confirmation of position remains valuable in emergencies, partly as historical preservation. Lighthouses are cultural landmarks, symbols of maritime safety, monuments to the keepers who served. Society has decided they're worth maintaining even if their practical importance has diminished. And partly because ships still use them. Commercial vessels, fishing boats, and recreational craft all reference lighthouses. The lights provide reassurance, confirmation of position, a visible reminder that someone, somewhere, is maintaining maritime safety infrastructure. The lights burn on. Not because they must, but because we choose to keep them burning. Because they represent something beyond mere functionality. Because darkness at a lighthouse location would feel. We've covered the transition to automation, the fate of the last keepers, and what happened to lighthouse stations after humans left. We've seen how technology solved many problems but couldn't eliminate all risk. And we've considered why lighthouses continue operating even as their necessity diminishes. In our final segment, we'll reflect on what lighthouse mysteries like Flannan Isles tell us. About isolation. About danger. About how humans respond to hostile environments. And about why these stories continue to fascinate us more than a century after the events occurred. We've spent 2 hours exploring lighthouse mysteries. The Flannan Isles disappearance. The Smalls incident. Keepers who went mad. Crews who vanished. Deaths both explained and unexplained. A century of isolation, danger, and the ocean's indifference to human life. What do these stories tell us? First, they remind us that nature remains dangerous. We live in an age of technology, of safety systems, of GPS and radar and instant communication. But the ocean is still vast. Storms are still deadly. Waves can still reach heights that destroy human structures. Rocks are still slippery. The margin between safety and catastrophe is still razor thin. Lighthouse keepers understood this. They lived with constant awareness of danger. They knew that one mistake, one moment of inattention, one freak wave could kill them. And they accepted it. That was the job. Second, these stories show us the limits of human psychology. We're social creatures. We need interaction, stimulation, connection. Extended isolation breaks some people. Not because they're weak, but because humans aren't designed for it. The keepers who went mad weren't failures. They were ordinary people pushed beyond human tolerances. Some people have higher thresholds for isolation than others, but everyone has limits. The lighthouse keepers who broke simply found theirs. Why do cases like Flannan Isles fascinate us more than explained deaths? Hundreds of lighthouse keepers died in documented accidents. Swept away by waves. Killed in storms. Fallen from towers. We know exactly what happened to them. Their deaths are tragic but comprehensible. Yet these deaths don't capture imagination the way Flannan Isles does. Because there's no mystery. No ambiguity. No room for speculation. Humans are drawn to the unexplained. We want patterns to make sense. When they don't, when gaps exist in our understanding, we fixate on them. We create theories. We build narratives. We try to impose meaning on absence. The Flannan Isles mystery persists not because it can't be explained, but because the explanation isn't satisfying. Swept away by a wave answers the question technically but doesn't scratch the psychological itch. We want something more. Something that matches the dramatic setting and the strange details. This is a feature of human cognition, not a flaw. The ability to detect patterns, to notice when things don't fit, to question explanations, these traits have survival value. But they also make us susceptible to seeing mystery where none exists. There's something else these stories reveal. A strange contradiction in how we view isolation. We fear it. The psychological dangers are real. The loneliness. The monotony. The way extended isolation can break minds. We understand why lighthouse keeping was so difficult. But we're also attracted to it. The idea of being alone on a remote rock. Away from society. Self-sufficient. Testing ourselves against nature and solitude. There's appeal in that image. Modern people seek isolation voluntarily. Wilderness retreats. Off-grid living. Remote cabins. We romanticize the lighthouse keeper's life while knowing intellectually how difficult it was. This reveals something about modern existence. We're overstimulated. Overconnected. Constantly bombarded with information and social demands. So we fantasize about the opposite. About silence. About simplicity. About being alone with our thoughts and the elements. But the reality of that isolation, as lighthouse keepers discovered, is harder than the fantasy. The occasional weekend in a remote cabin is restorative. Months on a rock in the Atlantic is destructive. Dosage matters. The lighthouse keepers didn't choose isolation because they found it appealing. They chose it because it was employment. Because it paid. Because it was a way to support families. And they endured it through duty and necessity, not because they enjoyed it. What should we remember about lighthouse keepers? Not the mysteries. Not the disappearances and strange deaths. Those are compelling stories, but they're not the essence of what lighthouse keeping was. We should remember the duty. Night after night, year after year, men climbed lighthouse towers and lit the lamps. In storms and calm. When sick and when healthy. Regardless of personal circumstances or difficulties. The light had to burn. Ships and sailors depended on that reliability. Countless lives were saved by lights burning faithfully through storms. Most keepers never experienced dramatic rescues or visible proof of their importance. They simply maintained lights and trusted that it mattered. That kind of quiet, persistent duty is worth remembering. It's not dramatic. It doesn't make exciting stories. But it's the foundation of civilization. People doing necessary work reliably, even when no one is watching, even when recognition never comes. We should also remember the sacrifice. The keepers who died doing this work. Not just the mysterious disappearances, but all of them. The falls. The drownings. The illnesses that killed because medical help was weeks away. The psychological breakdowns. The families left behind. Maritime safety was built on human cost. Every lighthouse represents keepers who endured isolation, danger, and hardship. Some paid with their lives. Others paid with years of their lives spent in lonely places. Both forms of sacrifice deserve acknowledgement. Lighthouse mysteries will continue to fascinate. New generations will discover the Flannan Isles story. Books will be written. Films made. Podcasts recorded. The mystery has taken on a life of its own, independent of the historical event. This isn't bad. Stories serve purposes beyond historical accuracy. They give us frameworks for thinking about isolation, danger, duty, and loss. They provide safe ways to explore fear and mystery. They connect us to the past and to others who wonder about the same questions. But while enjoying the mystery, we should remember it's built on tragedy. 3 real men died at Flannan Isles. Their families grieved. Their loss was real, not just a story element. Every lighthouse mystery involves real people. Real deaths. Real trauma for survivors and families. The mysteries are compelling, but they represent genuine suffering. We can appreciate both aspects. Enjoy the mystery while respecting the reality. Be fascinated by the unknown while honoring the known, that people died, that their work mattered, that their sacrifice enabled others to travel safely. So what really happened at Flannan Isles Lighthouse in December 1900? We've examined the evidence, explored the theories, compared it to similar cases, looked at the broader context of lighthouse keeping. The most likely explanation remains what it's always been. 3 keepers were swept away by waves while at the East Landing during a storm. The strange logbook entries reflect anxiety about severe weather. The missing oilskins indicate 2 went outside and the 3rd rushed out after them. A rogue wave or series of waves struck, and all 3 were lost. It's not a mysterious explanation. It's not supernatural. It requires no conspiracy or cover-up. It's just the ocean doing what the ocean does. Taking human lives with sudden, brutal efficiency. But the mystery persists. Because the explanation doesn't account for every detail. Because human psychology prefers dramatic mysteries to mundane tragedies. Because the story has been told so many times that fiction has blended with fact. Both things can be true. The probable explanation is rational and evidence-based. And the mystery is compelling and enduring. One doesn't invalidate the other. James Duckett, Thomas Marshall, and William MacArthur deserve to be remembered. Not just as a mystery, but as men who served. Who maintained a light on one of the most remote rocks in the British Isles. Who died doing that work. Lighthouse keeping is gone now. The last keepers have retired. The towers are automated. The lights burn without human hands tending them. But the legacy remains. The lighthouses still standing. The records of service. The stories of dedication and sacrifice. And yes, the mysteries too. All of it, together, forms the history of a profession that existed for centuries and is now extinct. A profession that was dangerous, lonely, difficult, and essential. Thank you for joining us on this journey. For exploring the mystery of Flannan Isles. For learning about lighthouse keeping and the men who served. For spending these 2 hours in the dark with strange stories of isolation and the sea. The lights still burn. On rocks and islands around the world. Automated now. Reliable. Safe. But empty. If you visit Flannan Isles today, you'll see the lighthouse still standing. The tower solid against Atlantic storms. The light flashing its pattern across the waves. Everything functioning perfectly. But the keeper's quarters are empty. The rooms where 3 men lived and died are silent. The island is as remote and forbidding as ever. And the mystery remains. Rest well. Dream of lights burning in the darkness. Of men maintaining duty against all odds. Of the ocean's vast indifference. of mysteries that endure because we need them to. Sweet E.T. dreams. And good night.